You may know about the major events that happened along the timeline of America's past, but are you familiar with the little-known facts of American history? Like how American icons such as the potato chip, the Ferris wheel, and the tissue came into existence, or when U.S. time zones and road maps first made life more organized. In the first half of this program, you'll discover these little-known stories that took place once upon a time in America. Then in the second half, you'll hear uncommon tales of some of America's lesser-known explorers and pioneers. They may not have famous names, but they still paved a path of innovation through science and exploration. So get ready to embark on a journey back in time to learn about the rest of American history. Since there have been people on this planet, there's been garbage. And before people had sanitation services, they often tossed their garbage into the streets. The resulting mess was so unbearable, some American cities in the mid-1800s explored a creative alternative. They purchased pigs. In towns such as Cincinnati, Ohio, and New York City, the pigs were let loose to wander the roadways, to feast to their heart's content on the refuse. A good idea in theory, but the pigs merely recycled the trash into a different kind of road and nose hazard. As an added drawback, the pigs were also cantankerous. They intimidated horses and knocked down people. All in all, the idea didn't quite work out. By 1860, sewers, sanitation systems, and street cleaners of the human variety were being established across the country. And thankfully, the pigs went back to the farms.
By the 1870s, young women were moving to big cities in search of education and better jobs. At that time in America, though, very few jobs were open to women, and most were tedious and low-paying. Seeing a need for change, a group of ladies in New York City founded an organization. They called it the YWCA, and they sought to help these young women. First, they surveyed the job market. They discovered that there was a shortage of trained personnel in stenography, and it was a fast-growing field with many well-paying positions. Responding quickly, the YWCA began stenography classes in New York City in 1879 and were so successful that typing classes were added in 1881. Thanks to the foresight of the YWCA, thousands of women entered the business world and benefited from opportunities that had never before been available to women.
With the increasing popularity of the automobile in the early 1900s, more and more people were discovering the pleasure of car travel. The Blue Book was one of the first attempts to get people from point A to point B. It consisted of written directions such as, go past the one-story frame house and then turn right. Of course, if the house had burned down, a person would be completely lost. Looking for a better solution, a map company decided to offer a prize for the best new map concept. The winning idea? Assign numbers to roads and post them along the road as well as on the map. Starting in Illinois, these numbers soon appeared across the nation. There was only one problem. Each map company used its own numbering system, resulting in a proliferation of signs and mass confusion. Then in 1927, national road numbers were finally established, and getting from point A to point B became a whole lot easier. The newspaper notice read, at the peremptory request of a large majority of the citizens of the United States, I, Joshua Norton, declare and proclaim myself Emperor. It was 1859, and Joshua Norton had fallen on hard times. Formerly a wealthy man, he had lost everything in a rash investment. The resulting psychosis caused him to have delusions of grandeur. Luckily for him, the people of San Francisco succumbed to his charm and treated him as if he were an emperor. He ate in restaurants without ever being asked to pay, and a chair was reserved for him in the state legislature. When the beloved Norton passed away, the citizens erected a monument to immortalize his unique claim. Only one person publicly decried the emperor's claim to nobility, and his case to have Norton declared insane was thrown out of court. The judge stated that Norton was about the best thing going in the King Line.
Early bicycling was only for the stout of heart. No brakes, hard tires, and hard seats meant little comfort and little control. Then the safety bike was introduced in 1889, and bicycling took off. With the comfort of new padded seats and inflatable tires, anyone could learn to ride, and millions of people did. Bicycle clubs with their organized activities became the rage. The wealthier clubs held formal teas and social events where men and ladies danced while riding their bicycles. Other clubs held picnics and country excursions. There were even sporting clubs that organized races and other competitive events. Parades were also a favorite activity for the bike set. One of the biggest took place on Riverside Drive in New York City. Throughout the gay 90s, the bicycle craze inspired clothing designs, songs, and stories. It was even partially responsible for the first widespread demand for better roads, something still appreciated today. Telephone operators, rapidly becoming a thing of the past, they were once a staple of everyday life. The very first operators were teenage boys. However, the phone companies soon discovered that the rowdy boys were not really mature enough to handle the responsibility needed to give the customers good service. They were much more interested in cheering on fistfights between comrades than in helping connect a panicked housewife to the fire department. Desperate to find competent operators, the phone companies turned to young women. It was a controversial step at the time because very few women worked outside the home. But the women operators soon proved to be quite adept. Along with phone connections, they were known to give stock market prices, movie theater information, even wake-up calls. These early operators were the lifeline of every small community, and with their help, phone service truly became a service. What time is it? An easy question to answer today. But prior to 1883, every town was responsible for keeping track of its own time. This led to some confusion. Often towns that were near each other would have different times. Wisconsin, for instance, had 38 different time zones. It was the railroad companies who finally started bringing order to our nation's timekeeping. Finding it impossible to keep its schedules organized, the train companies set up their own time system, neatly divided into 4 different zones. Most of the nation thought this was a good idea, and railroad time became the standard almost everywhere. But not every town gave in gracefully. Bath, Maine, for example, continued to be 20 minutes ahead of train time. Then in 1918, the federal government stepped in and passed the Standard Time Act, and for the first time, the entire nation was on the same time system.
Ah, the potato chip, one of life's gastronomic pleasures. But it started out as a punishment for a too picky customer. In 1853, Saratoga Springs, New York was a favorite vacation spot for the rich. Restaurants in the area hired famous chefs to cater to their wealthy and particular guests. One of these restaurants was called Moon's, and the temperamental chef there was a man named George Crumb. One day, Crumb got word that one of his patrons was displeased. The customer demanded a new batch of deep-fried potatoes that were a little thinner. While his temper aroused, Crumb decided to get even. He sliced the next batch of potatoes wafer thin. He then salted them heavily to make them even more inedible. To his surprise, they were the hit of the dining room. Little did George Crumb know that his potato chips would become one of the leading snack foods in the country.
The year was 1824, and 2 New York men were about to pull off one of the biggest hoaxes ever seen in this country. A retired carpenter known only as Lozier started the ball rolling by letting his bar cronies in on a little secret. He informed them that he and his friend, John DeVoe, were in tight with the mayor of New York City and had been asked by him to do a little job. With all the building going on at the tip of Manhattan, the island was starting to sink. The job was to saw Manhattan in half and tow it out to sea. Once there, it could be turned around, towed back, and reattached with all the buildings in the middle. People signed up by the hundreds to be laborers. Special 100-foot saws and 250-foot oars were ordered, and 500 head of cattle, 500 hogs, and 3,000 chickens were bought to feed the work crew. The day of groundbreaking dawned bright and clear. Bands played and crowds cheered. But Mr. Lozier and Mr. DeVoe were nowhere to be found.
In the 1920s, flight was still a new experience for most people, and the technology was improving almost daily. In 1929, a theater designer named Norman Bell Geddes and an engineer named Otto Kohler designed a passenger plane. But not just any passenger plane. This one could accommodate 450 passengers, and its crew would include a manicurist, a librarian, and 7 musicians. There'd be a large formal dining room, private dining rooms, a beauty parlor, and a glass-enclosed promenade housing a long list of shops. Powered by 20 engines, the mammoth plane would make the flight from the Midwestern United States to Europe in about 42 hours. Unfortunately, 1929 was also the year the Great Depression hit. People were barely getting by, and luxuries were few. By the time the nation recovered, smaller, more economical planes had become the standard. And this luxury airliner never made it off the blueprints.
In the early 1800s, the custom was for all men to be clean-shaven. It wasn't a law, it was just the custom of the era. But a Fitchburg, Massachusetts farmer named Joseph Palmer decided he wanted a beard. Or maybe he just hated shaving. All we know is that he grew a beard, a beautiful flowing beard, and his neighbors were outraged. So much so that he was denounced during sermons, stoned by angry citizens, and ostracized from community events. One day, a group of his neighbors got hold of him and tried to forcibly remove his beard. Mr. Palmer was determined to keep it and fought back. However, it was Palmer who was charged with assault, tried, and sent to jail. Joseph Palmer lived to become quite a local legend, and by the time he passed away in 1875, beards had become commonplace.
As the United States entered World War I, cellucotton was invented as a cheap substitute for cotton. It was used not only for surgical bandages, but for gas mask filters as well. Huge quantities were produced. And then the war ended. With warehouses full of cellucotton, companies began looking for another way to use it. One bright salesperson got the idea to promote it as a makeup remover, borrowing the glamour of Hollywood as a marketing tool. Famous movie stars soon began appearing in ads, and the public began snapping up the product. But the company began getting letters from housewives. It seems that their husbands were using their new makeup removers to blow their noses. As these complaints poured in, the company switched gears. They started promoting their product as disposable handkerchiefs, more commonly known today as tissue.
In 1892, an engineer named George Ferris built an attraction for the Chicago World's Fair that would rival the Eiffel Tower. It was a giant wheel, 250 feet in diameter. The 45-foot axle was the largest single piece of steel that had yet been forged. It had 36 wood-veneered cars, each capable of holding 60 people. Altogether, it carried more than 2,000 passengers. At the time, most people had never been higher than a 3-story building, about 30 feet. Passengers were amazed when at 264 feet, their view included the entire fair and nearby Chicago. Needless to say, the wheel was a resounding success. After the fair, it was used again for an exposition in 1904. Then it was demolished. Today, much smaller replicas can be found at almost any fair in the U.S., but none match the grandeur and the thrill of the very first Ferris wheel.
During the California Gold Rush, Charlie Parkhurst was a hard-drinking, tobacco-chewing stagecoach driver. One-Eyed Charlie, as he was called after a run-in with a horse, was a bit of a local legend. His skill with the reins was matched by his bravado, but for all his tough appearance, Charlie kept a little secret hidden. One-Eyed Charlie was actually a woman named Charlotte Parkhurst. As a child, she had run away from an orphanage and passed herself off as a stable boy. Making her way out west dressed as a man, she signed on as a stagecoach driver for Wells Fargo. As a driver, One-Eyed Charlie enjoyed a long and colorful career and kept her secret safe until her death. In addition, it was later discovered that Charlie had another noteworthy accomplishment. In November of 1868, Charlie Parkhurst is on record as having cast a ballot. and by doing so, may have been the first woman to ever vote in a presidential election.
The 1920s was the golden age of Hollywood, and movie producers were always on the lookout for a new star. They soon spotted a young man with natural talent. His name was George Herman Ruth, and he was signed to play the lead in an upcoming film. The shooting of the feature was completed in record time, and for only a few days' work, George received a check for $35,000. He was so proud of his sudden fortune that he carried the check around with him, showing it off to his friends, family, anyone who might be impressed. Months passed before George took the check to the bank, but during that time a lot had happened. The film was edited, released, and immediately considered a failure. The production company went bankrupt, and when George tried to cash the check, it bounced. It was a bitter lesson for George Herman Ruth. He went on to succeed, though, in his original vocation, baseball, and he starred in one more film, this time playing himself as Babe Ruth.
In the late 1800s, baseball was a rough game, but the job of the umpire was even rougher. There was just one official to keep track of the entire field, and more often than not, he was cast as the villain. Fans routinely cursed him, threw things at him, and ran him off the field. Players spiked him and hit him with fists and bats. Owners actually encouraged the violence, believing it would attract spectators. One of baseball's leading promoters, Albert Spalding, once said that in attacking umpires, fans were merely demonstrating their democratic right to oppose tyrants. By the end of the century, there were reports of 2 minor league umpires being killed in the line of duty, both struck with bats by angry players. The abuse continued until 1901. That year, the American League was established, and new regulations were finally drawn up to protect the umps. Around the country, it said a huge sigh of relief was heard, just behind home plate.
As a city, Chicago has a history that reaches far below its surface. It began in the 1850s when Chicago residents actually jacked up their buildings to build drainage tunnels underneath as protection against persistent flooding. When they were done, the city of Chicago was 12 feet higher and much drier. Then in 1900, city officials were wrestling with a severe traffic problem. To alleviate the congestion, another network of tunnels was proposed. Soon, there were 60 miles of freight tunnels 40 feet below the surface. 3,000 electric freight cars moved through the tunnels, eliminating 5,000 horse-drawn vehicles from the streets above. They were used to route mail, deliver goods, and remove garbage. The tunnels remained in use until the 1950s. By then, the growth of the trucking industry finally made the electric freight cars obsolete. Today, far below the hustle of Chicago's city streets, the tunnels remain as a symbol of Chicago's ingenuity.
American football at the turn of the century was an extremely savage sport. Padding and helmets were optional, and popular plays like the flying wedge just seemed to encourage fistfights. In the football season of 1905, 18 college players died, and 159 were seriously injured. After seeing a horrifying photograph of a player who was beaten during a game, President Theodore Roosevelt decided to take action. Roosevelt held a meeting with the 3 coaches from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. He told them that if the brutality of the game continued, he would personally abolish football by executive decree. The coaches and faculty members got together to redefine the sport. They created new regulations that stressed speed instead of force, and they invented the forward pass. The new regulations had an immediate effect. The next year, only 6 college players died of injuries, and 3 were from fistfights.
In 1869, a Mexican man left his country and moved to New York City. With him, he brought some chicle, the elastic-like sap from the sapodilla tree. The man had hoped he could market it as a substitute for rubber. The Mexican gave the chicle to an inventor by the name of Thomas Adams, but Adams couldn't find a suitable use for it. Then one day, Adams saw a girl buying paraffin, which at the time people sweetened and chewed. The paraffin gave Adams an idea. The next day, he brought the store owner some little gray balls of chicle, sweetened and flavored with some added ingredients. The product sold like wildfire and became the world's first chewing gum. And the man who was responsible for bringing chicle to America? None other than Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the famous Mexican general who led the attack on the Alamo, and who in 1869 was living in exile on Staten Island.
When it comes to desserts, Americans have had a long love affair with ice cream, including George Washington. The first president was a big fan, and his Mount Vernon kitchen included 2 pewter ice cream pots. Thomas Jefferson was equally addicted, so he invented an 18-step manufacturing process. Even the military wasn't immune from its powers. From the Civil War on, ice cream was used to boost morale. During World War I, it was declared an essential foodstuff and escaped being rationed. And in World War II, American bomber crews came up with a unique way to make the treat. They mixed the ingredients in a can, sealed it, then placed it in the rear compartment of the airplane. Once in the air, the plane's vibrations churned the mixture, and the high-altitude temperatures froze it, so that upon landing, the crew had a dish of perfectly blended ice cream. Today, even astronauts don't have to go without their favorite frozen treat. For them, it's conveniently freeze-dried.
Through the years, New York City has had its share of unusual customs, but one that was particularly strange was the practice of moving day. The custom began in colonial times. Due to an annual tax assessment, all rental leases were signed on May 1st of each year. If tenants wanted to change residences, they moved that day. In the early years, moving day wasn't much of a problem. But as the city grew, so did the commotion. By 1830, 1 out of 3 people moved on May 1st, and it was chaos. Streets were clogged, carts were in short supply, and movers quadrupled their fares. And for the poor, May Day was even worse. Those who couldn't find affordable dwellings ended up in a park with all their possessions. They were allowed to stay there one night. Those remaining the next day went to jail. Although the annual custom was called an abomination, the practice continued until the turn of the century.
In the early days of Florida's settlement, roads were few and mail delivery was often difficult. So if someone sent a letter from Palm Beach to Miami, the letter first had to travel by boat and train to New York, then by ship to Havana, then by schooner to Miami. The letter had to travel 3,000 miles and took as much as 2 months to arrive. A person could have literally walked it there faster. The U.S. Post Office soon realized this, and in 1885 established the barefoot route. Mail carriers were hired to walk the 136 miles barefoot along the shore, crossing the inlets in rowboats they stowed in the brush. The journey was hazardous and physically demanding, and one carrier even lost his life in the line of duty. When railroads finally linked the settlements in 1892, the route was discontinued. Today, a marker at the Hillsborough Lighthouse silently honors the barefoot mailmen who served the area.
When automobiles first appeared around the turn of the century, they were sometimes the object of ridicule and open hostility. They were described as being loud, smoky, and a nuisance to the general public. And early traffic laws seemed to reflect their unpopularity. Some states required that a mature individual walk ahead of any vehicle, waving a red flag to warn others of its impending passage. Other states required that motorists post a notice a week in advance if they wished to take their car on the road. But by far the most impractical law passed was the following. If an approaching auto frightened a horse, the motorist must stop and completely cover his car with a drab-colored cloth. If the horse was still upset, then the vehicle had to be disassembled and the parts concealed in the bushes until the animal had safely passed. Despite its early unpopularity, the automobile has eventually succeeded in ruling the road.
During the Depression, small business owners were desperately looking for ways to survive. Some found that if they could get motorists to slow down and notice their business, they might have a customer. And so began the era of wacky building designs. Called programmatic architecture, these whimsical roadside attractions grew in popularity in the early 1930s. They were scattered across the country, but in Southern California, the silly facades reached their peak. Some were obvious advertisements of the goods being offered, as in a coffee pot for a restaurant or a giant lemon for a lemonade stand. For others, the connection was less clear. Most of these delightful buildings were not built for posterity and simply crumbled over the years. The ones that do remain are revered as a form of folk art and are undoubtedly cherished landmarks.
In the late 1800s, women were still years away from being able to vote, yet one woman didn't let that discourage her. Victoria Woodhull was already a controversial figure in New York City. She and her sister had established a very successful stock brokerage firm on Wall Street, and they had founded a weekly newspaper which did quite well. But nothing compared to the campaign that Victoria organized in 1872 to run for the office of the President of the United States. She was at first admired by the suffragettes because she spoke out in favor of allowing women to vote, but soon her platform included less popular views. Victoria Woodhull also spoke out for free love, abortion, divorce, and legalized prostitution. Her campaign was the subject of the juiciest gossip and news stories of the day. Although her candidacy drew little response at the polls, Victoria Woodhull served to shake up the politics of 19th century Washington.
During the 1920s and 30s, Osa and Martin Johnson were among the best-known American explorers. As a husband and wife team, they spent 27 years exploring Africa and the South Pacific. Using airplanes, cameras, and sound recorders, the Johnsons made films that were among the first of their kind to be shown in the U.S. While Martin photographed their adventures, Osa learned to shoot and stood guard against animal attacks. During their journey to Africa, the Johnsons were the first to fly over Mount Kenya. They also discovered a magnificent body of water, which they named Lake Paradise. Even after Martin died in 1937, Osa continued to produce books, films, and articles detailing their adventures. Osa Johnson's work not only brought the excitement of their travels to life, it also served to pique the public's interest for more exploration.
In 1922, American explorer Roy Andrews led an archaeological expedition into the unmapped regions of Mongolia and the Gobi Desert. His group traveled by car, which had never before been used in the desert, and was provisioned by camel caravans. Andrews and his party were the first to find a skull and most of an intact skeleton from the world's largest known land mammal, the extinct 15-ton Baluchitherium. They also discovered the dinosaur we know as Protoceratops. But even more significant, they were the first to uncover fossilized dinosaur eggs, revealing for the first time how dinosaurs reproduced. Roy Andrews made many extraordinary finds during his 7 years of exploring the Gobi Desert. His discoveries not only contributed to our knowledge of the past, they also brought the past alive for millions of museum visitors. In 1839, John Lloyd Stephens, an American lawyer, and Frederick Catherwood, an English artist, organized an expedition to learn more about ancient civilizations. They explored much of Mexico and Central America, but the most notable sites they uncovered were the Mayan ruins of Copan in Honduras and Palenque in Mexico. Stephens surveyed the ancient sites, creating detailed maps, while Catherwood drew pictures of the intricate columns and altars that were found at both sites. When they returned, Stephens published a book putting forth new theories on the origins and accomplishments of the extinct Mayan civilization and its importance to the development of current cultures. Together with Catherwood, Stephens contributed a great deal to our understanding of the Mayan people and generated a renewed interest in the study of extinct Central American societies.
In 1881, Adolphus Greeley was an officer with the U.S. Army Signal Corps. He was sent to lead an expedition to Ellesmere Island, just west of Greenland. The primary goal of the team was meteorological research, but Greeley and his men explored the region as well. They discovered Lockwood Island off the coast of Greenland and set a record for traveling the farthest north. They also discovered a fjord which they named after Greeley. But as their expedition wore on, they began to have some setbacks. Their supply ship was overdue and several rescue ships failed to reach them. Out of food, Greeley and his men headed south. In the intense cold, conditions rapidly deteriorated. It took 3 years before they were finally rescued, and only 7 of the 23 men survived. Adolphus Greeley was one of those 7. In honor of his leadership and courage, an Army post in Alaska, Fort Greely, bears his name.
The deepest known place on Earth is the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean near the island of Guam. In 1960, U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh and a Swiss oceanographer, Jacques Piccard, prepared to dive into this mysterious chasm. A bathyscaphe called the Trieste, an innovative diving craft, was to be used for the journey. Entering the Trieste, Walsh and Piccard descended at the rate of 200 feet per minute, falling quickly to depths that no man had ever reached before. When they arrived near the bottom of the trench, 200,000 tons of water pressure was resting on the Trieste. She withstood the strain and allowed Walsh and Piccard to view sea life that was previously thought impossible to exist at such a depth. Having proved that man could go to the bottom of the ocean and return safely, Lieutenant Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard helped pave the way for future deep-sea exploration.
In the early 1900s, New Guinea was probably the least known inhabited territory in the world. Then in 1926, American explorer Matthew Stirling led an expedition into the island's interior. Stirling hoped to chart and describe the tribes of pygmies that were rumored to live in the Nassau Mountains. Since the country was extremely difficult to traverse, airplanes were used to set up camps along the route. On their first trip, Stirling and his pilot were unloading supplies. Suddenly, dozens of pygmies attacked, sending the men flying to safety. They found out later that the natives, never having seen a plane before, were afraid of the noisy beast and were trying to kill it. Stirling went on to befriend the natives and successfully map their habitat. The information that Stirling gathered on his trips proved invaluable, giving us a glimpse of how our cultures might have evolved from a Stone Age existence.
In 1911, Hiram Bingham, a Yale history professor, was offered the opportunity to lead an expedition to Peru in search of Incan ruins, including El Dorado, the fabled city of gold. Bored with his academic career, Bingham accepted the challenge. In the Urubamba Valley in Peru, Bingham set out with a local farmer to climb to the top of a sheer cliff. As he reached the top, Bingham saw tier upon tier of Inca terraces rising upward like giant stairs. Exploring along the terraces, he discovered the extensive ruins of a once magnificent city, Machu Picchu. His team brought back precise geographical information, and his discovery spurred renewed archaeological activity in both North and South America. Bingham later became governor of Connecticut and then a U.S. senator, but he always listed explorer as his primary occupation. Lincoln Ellsworth was already a renowned American explorer when he joined his first polar expedition in 1924. From then on, he made polar exploration his life's work. His most notable achievement was the first aerial crossing of Antarctica. The undertaking began in 1935. Ellsworth's group left Dundee Island, just north of the Antarctic Peninsula, and headed for the other side of the continent. They were forced to stop 3 times due to weather conditions, and then they ran out of fuel. Although Ellsworth and his pilot had to complete the crossing on foot, the expedition was hailed as a success. 4 years later, Ellsworth led an aerial photographic team into Antarctica, providing the information that led to the first maps of the continent. Lincoln Ellsworth not only helped open more of our planet to exploration, he also claimed some 35,000 square miles of Antarctic territory for the United States.
In 1924, a Boston surgeon by the name of Alexander Hamilton Rice was determined to find the origin of the Amazon River. He had attempted this 6 times before, but had been blocked by impassable rapids. This time he would be accompanied by a Curtiss Seagull flying boat, crewed by a veteran Navy pilot and an Army aerial photographer. Rice and his main party traveled up the Amazon by boat, while the plane flew ahead, scouting for Indian villages, establishing supply bases, and mapping the river. In 30 minutes, the plane flew one stretch of the rapids that would have taken up to 16 days to navigate by canoe. They ventured into areas that no explorer had ever seen before, and located the headwaters of one of the Amazon's major tributaries. The Rice expedition completed the first accurate mapping of the Amazon basin. and surveyed an area that was larger than France and Germany combined. John Colter was one of America's earliest explorers. He headed west with the Lewis and Clark expedition, but left to strike out on his own. Traveling along the Yellowstone River in 1807, he became the first white man to see the great thermal basins in what is now Yellowstone National Park. Colter spent considerable time exploring the West. He associated closely with many Indian tribes, and at one point was taken hostage by the Blackfoot Indians in the Three Forks area of Montana. The Indians killed his companion, then stripped Colter of his clothes and equipment, and turned him loose on the prairie to be hunted down. He outran his pursuers and made his way, naked and unarmed, 300 miles to the nearest settlement. John Colter recovered and became renowned for his extensive knowledge of the region. His many experiences and discoveries proved to be a major source of information about the American frontier.
In the late 18th century, rumors were rampant among the sailing trade of a great river that emptied into the Pacific Ocean. Breakers and sandbars were said to block its entrance. In 1792, American naval captain Robert Gray found the river and braved the dangers at the mouth to sail his ship, the Columbia, into the interior. The ship dropped anchor upriver, and Gray and some of his men went ashore to meet with the Indians living along the banks. Several days later, an English ship arrived in the river and tried to claim the area for England. But because Gray had made friends with the Indians, it was proven that the Americans were there first, and the vast Pacific Northwest became part of American territory. This area has since been divided into the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and part of Montana and Wyoming. The river that Gray sailed into is called the Columbia River, after his ship, and is one of the main waterways in the Northwest.
John Muir was an American explorer and conservationist. Throughout the mid-1800s, he traveled extensively in the Northwest. Muir gathered invaluable information about the Alaska region and brought back tales of its natural beauty. One of the state's ice floes is named Muir Glacier in honor of its discoverer. As much as he enjoyed the North, his first love was Yosemite Valley in California. Muir spent 6 years exploring and studying the valley and was the first to explain its glacial origins. Striving to preserve the wilderness he loved, he founded the Sierra Club. And in 1890, he convinced President Theodore Roosevelt to make Yosemite Valley a national park. We can still enjoy the natural beauty of places like Yosemite Valley, thanks mainly to John Muir, a man well ahead of his time in conservation efforts.
During the 1820s, Jedediah Smith made a name for himself as a fur trader and mountain man. But in 1826, he began an epic journey that would redefine his life. Searching for new trapping grounds, Smith and his companions wandered through what is now Nevada, into Arizona, across the Mojave Desert, and into the Sierra Mountains. They found the mountain passes blocked with snow, leaving them stranded. Unwilling to risk his whole party, Smith and 2 men set out to find a way around the blocked passes, while the rest made camp in a sheltered area. After a grueling 3-month trip, Smith and his 2 companions reached their destination, Bear Lake, Idaho. Resting for only 3 days, Smith went back for the men he had left behind. He had become the first white man to make the journey to California on land and across the Great Basin in Nevada. Jedediah Smith's extensive travels opened the door for westward expansion and the continued development of our country.
In 1904, Julia Morgan created quite a stir when she opened an architectural firm in San Francisco. She was, after all, a young woman. But when a campanile she designed for a college withstood the 1906 California earthquake, her reputation was made. It was built with a new construction technique that she pioneered, using steel to reinforce concrete. Morgan went on to design hundreds of buildings from Salt Lake City to Honolulu. One of her more famous structures is the Hearst Castle, a magnificent home she created for William Randolph Hearst at San Simeon, California. Her work at San Simeon included more than just the house. She also designed all the outbuildings, from the hothouses to the kennels, including a zoo. In her long career, Julia Morgan designed over 700 buildings. and the construction technique she pioneered, reinforced concrete, is still in use today.
Edwin Hubble was a pioneer in the field of astronomy. In 1923, while working as an astronomer at the Mount Wilson Observatory in California, Hubble was the first to confirm the existence of other galaxies beyond our own. By the end of the decade, he had discovered that the other galaxies were moving away from the Milky Way, and that the galaxies farthest away were moving the fastest. These findings led to the formation of the Big Bang Theory, which is widely accepted by today's astronomers as the explanation for the beginning of the universe. Hubble was also the first to provide evidence that the universe is homogeneous, meaning the same in all directions as far as the telescope can see. When scientists placed a powerful telescope in orbit around Earth, they named it the Hubble telescope, a fitting tribute to the man who discovered that our universe was much bigger than just the Milky Way.
It was the turn of the century, and a young bicyclist named Glenn Curtis became interested in motorized bikes. He developed lightweight engines for his motorcycles, making them extremely popular for racing. The lightweight engines caught the attention of flying enthusiasts, and soon Curtis was involved in the design and manufacture of airplanes. He went on to design and build the first successful seaplane, and later his NC-4 flying boat became the first plane to make a transatlantic flight. His aircraft were used to demonstrate takeoffs and landings from ships, leading to the birth of seaborne aviation. One of Curtis's major technical contributions was the invention of the aileron, which gives pilots more control over their aircraft. Glenn Curtis's love of tinkering and speed helped propel the development of today's aviation and helped make the United States a leader in flight technology.
Before World War II, many people who were injured died from loss of blood. Only whole blood could be used for transfusions, and it was extremely perishable, making it difficult to use, particularly on the battlefield. Then, in 1938, a physician named Charles Drew began experimenting with blood at Columbia University. He found that the liquid part of blood, plasma, could be separated from the whole blood. The plasma could be kept longer and given to any blood type. This meant that for the first time, there was a blood substitute that could be utilized effectively under battle conditions. With World War II raging on two fronts, the need for plasma increased. Charles Drew began organizing blood banks and blood donation programs. Thousands of pints were rushed overseas, and thousands of servicemen survived because of the life-saving fluid and the work of Charles Drew. John Roebling came to America in 1831 from his native Germany. He was a bridge engineer, and his specialty was suspension bridges. In 1841, he produced the first wire cable used in the United States. But Roebling's greatest project was the design and construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. The main span of the bridge would be the longest ever attempted. But John Roebling died in an accident during excavation for the bridge pilings. It was left to his son, Washington, to complete the structure. Then, 3 years later, Washington Roebling suffered an accident at the construction site that left him disabled. The bridge was finished under his supervision, with assistants and supervisors relaying his orders. When completed in 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was hailed as one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century and considered one of the modern wonders of the world.
The science of information. It's something familiar to us today, but in the 1930s and 40s, it was a new concept. And one of its pioneers was an American engineer named Vannevar Bush. In 1930, he invented the differential analyzer. It was a device that measured the movement of gears and levers to solve differential equations. In short, it was the first analog computer. Bush continued to make contributions as an inventor in many fields, and in 1941, he was appointed the first director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. From this position, Bush guided much of the weapons and science research during World War II, including the development of machines used to break enemy codes. In 1945, Vannevar Bush made a statement radical for the times. He published an article in which he predicted that in the future, there would be personal information machines small enough for a desktop. The introduction of the personal computer proved him right. Nikola Tesla came to the United States in 1884. He worked briefly with Thomas Edison before he started doing research on his own. Tesla became a pioneer in electrical engineering before electricity was a household item. His first important contribution was an electrical motor he developed and then sold to George Westinghouse. He went on to develop the alternating current system, which is widely used today. He also invented motors which use the alternating current and devised a process for changing or transforming electrical voltage. Without these, it would not be feasible to transmit electricity or use it in the home. Even though Tesla did further research in many different areas and patented more than 1,600 inventions, it was his miniaturization of the electric motor and the development of the alternating current system that truly revolutionized society.
In the late 1830s, not much was known about the Earth's past. But Swiss immigrant Louis Agassiz changed that. He spent his life studying glaciers and the way they moved. By charting the impact glaciers made on the surrounding land, Agassiz was able to form new opinions on the evolution of the Earth's surface. He surmised that much of the Earth was once covered with glaciers and described this era as the Ice Ages. He supported his theory with information gained from the distribution and marking of rocks. He also provided evidence that an enormous glacier once created the largest lake bed in North America. As a tribute to his discovery, the now extinct lake is called Lake Agassiz. Louis Agassiz spent a great deal of his life teaching and trained a new generation of naturalists. He also gave us a better understanding of the processes that shape our world, both in the past and the present.
Henry Dreyfuss began his career as a theatrical designer in New York City in the early 1920s. He was an assistant to the famous designer Norman Bel Geddes. By 1929, he opened his own studio and branched out into a new area, industrial design. At the time, manufactured items like telephones and alarm clocks had always been designed with the ease of manufacturing as the only goal. Henry Dreyfuss started a revolution by designing items for functionability, safety, and ease of use. He designed such everyday items as telephones, vacuum cleaners, and cameras. His work soon expanded to include thermostats, tractors, airplane interiors, even gas stations and prosthetics, always keeping the consumer in mind. As a pioneer in industrial design, Henry Dreyfuss helped make our lives easier and elevated the design profession to an art.
Othniel Marsh was an American paleontologist in the late 1800s, a time when the science of paleontology, the study of extinct life forms, was in its infancy. Driven by an intense rivalry with another famous scientist, Edward Cope, Marsh and his team unearthed tons of dinosaur bones. One of his best-known discoveries was the Triceratops. He became the first vertebrate paleontologist to work for the U.S. Geological Survey, personally discovering more than 1,000 fossils and compiling an unparalleled collection of bones. In addition to the physical aspects of his finds, Marsh contributed much-needed proof for the theory of evolution. In 1977, Othniel Marsh was recognized for his many contributions to paleontology when the Nanosaur, a dinosaur he had discovered in 1877, was renamed the Othnielia.
In 1931, Carl Jansky was an American radio engineer. His employer had set him to work uncovering the source of some annoying static being received along with transoceanic radio messages. Jansky was able to determine that there were 3 different sources for the static. One was interference from local storms, while the second was from storms further away. The third source was a bit more elusive. Persevering, Jansky finally determined that the origin of the noise was not coming from our planet, but from outside our solar system. From that discovery, the new field of radio astronomy was born. Today, using radio telescopes, scientists are able to study the topography of distant planets and search for life outside our solar system. Carl Jansky's work has also led to the discovery of pulsars, neutrons, black holes, and many other significant aspects of our universe.
In June of 1965, American astronaut Ed White was high above the Earth aboard Gemini 4, hurtling along at 17,500 miles per hour. It was during this mission that White would become the first American to walk in space. He was scheduled to be outside for 10 minutes, secured by a slender 25-foot lifeline. But when his 10 minutes had passed and ground control called for him to return to the capsule, his response was, "I'm not coming in. I'm having too much fun." Nothing anyone said could convince him to give up the spectacular views. Finally, 21 minutes after he started his walk, he returned to the spacecraft. White had walked some 6,000 miles in Earth orbit. His venture proved that man could survive in the vacuum of space and paved the way for lunar exploration. Ed White was also scheduled to be on the first Apollo mission, but a fire on the launch pad took his life and the lives of his 2 fellow crew members.
Welcome back. How was that for American History Trivia? We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Little Known Facts of American History. Look for more history and geography titles in the Just the Facts Learning Series. And remember, learning can be fun.